My wife asked me if she could dance with her boss on that special night. A company party, dressed up, dim lights, forced laughter, and drinks masking the tension. I was sitting at the table, feigning attention to an inane conversation, when she approached with that measured smile, the same one she wore when she knew she was asking for the wrong thing but tried to play it off. And it was there, with the muffled sound of modern jazz in the background, that she asked, "Can I dance with him?" I didn't hesitate. I looked her in the eye and answered dryly, directly, with a taste of iron in my mouth, "You can. Go ahead and have him already." She let out a nervous laugh, trying to turn my sarcasm into jealousy, thinking my response was just a passing provocation. But when her eyes dropped to my hand, which was tightly gripping the crumpled napkin with the message I'd printed from that phone screen, with the audio recordings of her and her boss, the laughter died. The blood drained from her face. And in that moment, with the calm of someone who has suffered enough, I got up and left. Unhurriedly. Without fuss. Without shouting. In that restrained, silent gesture, our story ended. I didn't scream because the pain had been screaming inside for days. Because I'd already cried before I even knew everything. Because when a love dies inside, the burial is discreet. When a bond is broken by betrayal, there's no voice left, only silence. I'd already seen the messages, heard her giggles on the phone, noticed the scent of a different perfume that clung to her clothes after the long meetings. I'd already felt the distance in her kisses, the tenseness in her body in her hugs, the absence in her eyes. And yet, I stayed there. Trying. Believing. Wanting her to come back alone. To come to her senses. But she didn't. She went all the way. She chose. And that dance at the party was just the cherry on top of the betrayal that was already made. I left that night in a heavy silence. I stopped by my house, packed a small bag, and left. I didn't make a fuss. I didn't write a note. I didn't leave a hint. I just went. She tried to call me. I let it ring. She texted me saying she needed to talk, that it had been a mistake, that it wasn't what I was thinking. But she knew. I knew. And deep down, she just didn't think I'd have the courage to go. But I went. Because when respect ends, love has nowhere else to live. In the following days, I heard from mutual friends that the boss disappeared right after the party. He vanished without explanation. His interest was shallow. Fleeting. She was left alone. Amidst shame, silence, and a regret that came too late. Silence is the dry cry of someone who no longer has anything to justify. And she was caught in the middle of it all. Alone, with her own choices. I moved on with my life. In pain, yes. But moving forward. And time, as always, presented me with a new love. A love without mistrust. A love that didn't make me doubt whether the smile was sincere or disguised. A love that didn't make me sleep alone while the others' meeting was delayed. A love that said, I arrived safely, without me needing to ask. And it was in this calm that I rediscovered what I had lost, peace. And perhaps, even more than that, dignity. But fate, ironic as ever, never leaves a thread unturned without pulling one or two just to test the scar. Months later, she reappeared. Shy. Thinner. With the scarred eyes of someone who'd spent sleepless nights. She called me over to talk. He said he didn't want to insist, that he just needed to look me in the eyes and ask for forgiveness. He said he never imagined he'd lose so much. That he thought he could play with something as fragile as love. That boss never wanted anything more than a moment of vanity. That when he realized, it was too late. I listened to it all. In silence. Not out of indifference, but out of respect for the pain. Because I'd been through it before. And now it was her turn. And when she finished speaking, waiting for anything, a response, a gesture, a hopeful forgiveness, I simply said I forgave her. Because holding on to resentment would only prolong the pain. But I didn't go back. Because forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. Much less reliving it. She cried. He tried to remind me of our plans. Of the apartment we decorated together. Of the trips. Of the dates. Of the photos I still had. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had died the day I read those messages. The day I heard her laugh at another man. The day I saw my love exchanged for a hallway flirtation. She lost me there. And what was left afterward was only ownerless longing. Life, with its subtle and raw irony, was kind to me. It gave me time. It gave me distance. And it gave me someone new. Someone whole. Someone who didn't need to see my pain to value me. But for her, life wasn't so easy. Because when you lose a true love, you don't just miss the person, you miss the peace that love brought. The way that someone looked at you as if you were the best part of their day. She lost that. And only those who have experienced that kind of love know how much it hurts to know you'll never feel the same again. The strangest thing is that she tried to start over. I knew. She tried other relationships. But she always ran into comparisons. No one was as patient as I was. No one listened to her the way I did. No one knew her little quirks. And then, one day, perhaps at the height of guilt or longing, she wrote a letter. A long letter. Full of regret, memories, and apologies. In that letter, she told me everything she hadn't had the courage to say before. As if the paper could absorb what her mouth had never managed to utter without breaking. But when she decided to give me, it was too late. Because that same week, I got married. Yes, I got married again. To someone who knew how to love me even when I was still bleeding. To someone who didn't have to compete with ghosts because she brought me presents. When she found out, she hesitated to deliver the letter. But she went. She went to the place where we met years ago. She saw me from afar, holding hands with another woman. A slight smile, a silly conversation. But genuine. And there, in that moment, she broke down. And not for me. But for everything she let slip. The letter never reached me. A mutual friend later told me that she had thrown it into the sea, in a last-ditch attempt to erase her feelings. But I didn't need to read it anymore. Because I already knew. The weight of her loss was greater than mine. Because while I had started over, she was still trying to return to a place that no longer existed. And that is the worst kind of pain, longing for what was destroyed by one's own hands. Now, everything seems distant. But the memory still lingers. And while I don't wish her any harm, I also don't want to go back. Some stories end not with screams or scandals. But with a dance. A last dance she did with another man, unaware that in that slow, smiling step, she was dancing the end of everything alone. The most curious thing. She didn't realize that that night, while she was dancing with him, I had already left, but not from the ballroom. I had already left her. And that she only realized too late. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fiction, but they carry deep truths about the real consequences of wrong choices. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal destroys homes, erodes trust, and changes destinies. Get ready, because what you're about to hear, no, it's not just a story, it's a warning. Fasten your seatbelts. A shocking story is about to begin. She wore light dresses even on cloudy days. He preferred neutral, understated clothes, as if he wanted to disappear from the world when he walked down the street. She smiled with her eyes. He listened with his body. She was the wind. He was the roots. And that was exactly what brought them together. They weren't grand coincidences or those passions that overwhelm everything, but a subtle blend of silences that fit together. Her name was Emily, and his was Daniel. They had little in common on the surface, but deep down, there was something few couples share: comfort. With her, Daniel felt he didn't need to prove himself. With him, Emily felt she could fail. They didn't demand perfection, just presence. They met in a random cafe, between an abandoned book and a mutual request. Chance chuckled that day. But destiny took it seriously. Emily was an architect, detail-oriented, vain without exaggeration, passionate about aesthetics and balance. Her world was made of lines and symmetries, but her heart was pure chaos, a beautiful chaos that Daniel loved to slowly decipher. He, on the other hand, was a literature professor. He loved the silence of libraries and the stories that lived between the commas. He had a calmness that made Emily slow down without realizing it. He wasn't charismatic in the classic sense, but he had a gentle way of approaching the world that made him impossible to ignore. When he spoke, people stopped. When he smiled, their eyes grew smaller. And Emily loved observing this detail as if it were her own secret. They built a life together like assembling a rare puzzle, piece by piece, carefully. They started in a small apartment, where the walls knew the names of every dream. They planted books on the shelf, scattered paintings around the house, learned to cook by stumbling, fought over trivial matters, and made up with long hugs in the hallway. They shared bills and fears. They found each other's quirks amusing, though Emily still got annoyed when he left the cups on the table and Daniel still rolled his eyes every time she forgot to turn on the lights in every room. But at the end of the day, it was all about them. And that was enough. The routine, as it always does, settled in. Emily grew professionally, took on bigger projects, and became a role model among her colleagues. She had talent, but also ambition, a hunger for recognition that Daniel respected, even if he didn't fully understand it. He, however, remained true to his own rhythm. He taught classes, corrected essays, read classics in silence. He was content with what he had, with the life he led, with the love he received. He didn't want more, didn't demand more. And perhaps this was the first invisible disconnect between them, the fact that one still wanted to conquer the world, while the other only wanted to hold on to what he already had. On their anniversary, he wrote letters. She laughed, cried, and then put them all away in a cardboard box with a red bow. On Sundays, they made coffee together, Emily tended the table, Daniel the bread. And, while the radio played something soft in the background, they talked about everything: family, politics, movies, the neighbor who sang poorly, the children they might have one day. But over time, these conversations began to change. Emily was a little more absent. She had events, meetings, deadlines. She started bringing her laptop to the dinner table. Her eyes, once so full of presence, were now lost among notifications and spreadsheets. Daniel saw this, but didn't complain. He knew that professional growth was important to her. And how could he blame her for that? She fought for everything she believed in. He just didn't know that, in this fight, she would begin to distance herself from what they had built. The love between them didn't die overnight. No love dies that way. It gradually transformed, like water evaporating without anyone noticing. The hugs became quicker, the kisses rarer, the nights quieter. And Daniel, who always noticed every detail, felt this shift as if it were a change of seasons. There was no fight, no argument. Just a different silence. A colder touch. A look that shifted. He began waking in the middle of the night and looking to the side of the bed where she should be. And sometimes she was there, but even though she was present, she seemed distant. That's when he began writing less. The letters lessened. The music stopped playing. But even then, he stayed. Because he still believed it was just a phase. Emily, for her part, was experiencing a mixture of exhaustion and euphoria. She was rising in her career, being praised, being noticed. She was invited to important events, saw her name appear in publications, met influential people. But even with all this recognition, there was a strange emptiness she couldn't name. She felt like something was slipping through her fingers, even though everything was going well. And perhaps because of this, she began to become overly involved in the new world she was discovering. A world of lights, of different people, of voices that constantly praised her. People who looked at her as if she were unique. And in this new universe, sometimes, she forgot to look back. She forgot the breakfast table. She forgot the letters. She forgot the hands that had always been there for her, even when no one else believed in her potential. Little by little, weekends together became an exception. Conversations lost their spark. Messages during the day were limited to, "How did you get home okay?" or, "Are you coming home for dinner?" And, silently, Daniel began harboring unanswered questions. Where was she when she was out so late? With whom did she share the laughter she no longer brought home? What had changed? But he didn't ask. He was afraid of the answer. Because sometimes we prefer to live with doubt than face the truth. Despite the subtle distance, there were still moments when everything seemed normal. A special dinner here, a memory there, a caress lost in the rush. Moments when Daniel fooled himself into thinking the love was still there, just hidden behind exhaustion. And Emily, even confused, still felt comfort lying beside him. She still found peace in that silent embrace. But peace is sometimes confused with boredom. And somewhere between calm and restlessness, Emily began to confuse what she felt. It was at this point in the story that the imbalance began to hurt most. Daniel began walking alone on Sundays. He began eating dinner alone. He began writing again, but now in hidden journals. He put into words everything he couldn't say out loud. He wrote about absence, about fear, about the feeling of losing something that hadn't yet completely gone away. He felt like he was being gradually abandoned, like someone forgotten in a room while life went on outside. Emily, on the other hand, felt torn. At home, the love was calm and safe. Outside, the adrenaline, the new, the compliments, the feeling of being seen differently. There was no malice. There was confusion. And that's how many loves begin to die, not from a lack of feeling, but from too much noise, distractions, and a lack of communication. She didn't know how to get back, and he didn't know how to ask her to stay. So they continued to feign normalcy, each carrying a part of what was left. Time, relentless, marched on. Their wedding anniversary approached. Daniel planned something discreet, a dinner, a song, maybe a letter. He still wanted to believe. He still hoped something would rekindle. Emily said she'd try to be home early. And that day, he arrived with flowers, set the table, and kept the wine ready. But she was late. She said she had an important meeting. He waited. And while he waited, he wrote. And while he wrote, something inside him began to understand what was about to happen. He didn't know everything yet, but he could already feel it. Because the heart always knows. Even when the eyes still refuse to see. And that night, when she finally walked into the house with a tight smile and an apology, something in the air was already different. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He just watched her. He put away dinner. He put away the letter. And when she asked if he was okay, he simply said yes. Because sometimes, silence is more honest than any explanation. What neither of them knew that night was that they were about to cross the point of no return. A point where you either rebuild everything, or lose it all for good. But before that, there was one last dance. One party. One question. One answer that would change everything. And the beginning of the end, was about to begin. The room was filled with voices, the sound of glasses clinking in the air, and the laughter of those feigning happiness behind full glasses. The company party had started less than an hour ago, but the atmosphere already exuded the kind of discomfort Daniel had always hated. Colored lights flashed, the music was too loud, and he watched people trying to look important. Emily looked different that night. The black dress she wore molded to her body as if it had been made for her, and her loose hair reflected the golden light of the room. Daniel noticed everything, every gesture, every look. And although he tried to convince himself he was just tired, something in him told him that this night wouldn't end like the others. Emily chatted animatedly with some colleagues while Daniel stood at a distance, his glass firmly in his hands and a silence that hid more than any words could explain. That's when she approached, with that studied smile, and asked if she could dance a song with her boss. The question was light, but the impact was heavy. He looked at her for a long time, and time seemed to stand still for an instant. The whole world fell silent before he said, in a voice he barely recognized, "Go ahead and have it." Emily's smile trembled. She gave a short laugh, trying to transform his dry tone into jealousy. "No need to exaggerate, it's just a dance," she replied with forced lightness, but her eyes began to lose their shine. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on her, without anger, without irony, just with a deep weariness. He didn't need to say anything else. Emily understood. The air between them became thick, dense, impossible to penetrate. Her laughter died midway, replaced by a silence that seemed to scream. She tried to move closer, but he took a step back, and in that restrained movement, she realized what she hadn't yet dared to accept: he knew. He knew more than she imagined. He knew enough to give up. As she stood there, motionless, he set his glass down on the table and left the room. The music continued playing, the people continued dancing, and she remained there, alone in the crowd. Inside, something collapsed. Her heart pounded wildly, her hands sweating. She tried to follow him, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt the weight of her own choices crushing her chest. Everything that had seemed exciting, forbidden, and new now smelled of regret. The boss approached and asked if everything was okay. She simply waved, hiding it with a lifeless smile. She said she was tired and left before her despair made her cry in public. The night ended without goodbyes. Daniel didn't come home that night, and Emily spent the next few hours pacing, calling his cell phone, sending unanswered messages. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When morning came, his suitcase was gone. In the kitchen, the table still held his 2 breakfast mugs, but only one was dirty. He was gone, and the void left by his absence felt bigger than the entire apartment. Emily sat on the living room floor, hugging her knees, trying to understand when their love had been lost. She cried soundlessly, as if her entire body was crying, but not a single tear was enough to carry the weight of guilt. In the days that followed, she tried to contact him. She sent emails, messages, went to his work, waited at the door, but Daniel wouldn't see her. He didn't respond to anything. His silence was the cruelest punishment. There was no anger or aggression, just absence. And this absence hurt more than any fight. Their mutual friends were divided between discomfort and pity. Some said he needed time, others that she needed to respect his space. None of them knew what had really happened. Only she knew. And only she bore all the blame. As the weeks passed, regret turned to despair. Emily began to replay everything in her mind, the moments she'd let herself be carried away by the easy words, the late dinners, the conversations that began with compliments and ended in confessions. She wondered how she could have confused attention with love, desire with meaning, novelty with happiness. Everything now seemed small, pathetic, shameful. Daniel was her real love, her everyday love, the patient, silent love she traded for a brief fantasy. Time passed, and his absence only deepened. The messages stopped, her friends stopped mentioning his name, and the apartment began to feel like a museum of memories she couldn't bring herself to erase. Months later, when her routine had already become survival, a mutual friend mentioned that Daniel was fine. That he'd met someone. Emily feigned indifference, but her stomach clenched as if she'd been punched. She spent the night awake, turning over memories, reliving the words she'd said, the promises she'd broken. It was in this whirlwind of memories that she decided to write a letter. She wanted to apologize, to say what she'd never had the courage to say in person. She wrote for hours, non-stop, as if each word were an attempt to breathe again. The letter began coldly and technically, but gradually regret seeped into her sentences. She spoke of the emptiness she felt, of the mistake that consumed her every day, of the regret that weighed more heavily than any punishment. She said she didn't want to go back, that she didn't deserve forgiveness, but that she needed him to know she loved him, and that she always had, even when she messed everything up. When she finished, she cried into the paper, her tears smearing the ink. Carefully folding the paper, he decided to hand it over. He wanted to look at it one last time. Days later, with the letter in hand, she went to the cafe where they had met years before. The same cafe, the same window, the same corner table. She entered with a pounding heart, searching for his face among the customers. And then she saw him. He was there, sitting at the table they usually chose, laughing. But he wasn't alone. Across from him was a woman. Dark-haired, with a serene expression, simple gestures. The way he looked at her made the ground disappear beneath Emily's feet. It was the same gaze that had once been hers, a calm, whole, loving gaze. He touched the new woman's hand naturally, spontaneously, with that silent tenderness he'd always possessed. Emily felt her chest break. It wasn't jealousy, it was realization. The love she had lost now belonged to someone else. The future she had once imagined with him was now someone else's life. She stood still, unable to move. Time seemed to stretch, the noise of conversations around her grew distant, and she realized she was clutching the letter so tightly that the paper began to crumple. She considered approaching, saying something, but fear paralyzed her. What would she say? That she regretted it? That she loved him? Nothing would change what she saw before her. He was happy. And that happiness, even silent, was the final point she had never had the courage to make. She turned and left the cafe, the cold wind beating against her face, tears stinging. She walked aimlessly, clutching the letter to her chest. She stopped at a nearby bridge and, without much thought, dropped the paper into the water. She watched the letter fall, floating for a few seconds before being swept away by the current. It was the goodbye she deserved, no words, no apologies, no audience. As the paper disappeared, Emily understood something she had never understood before: his forgiveness had already been given. Not with words, but with the absence of resentment. He had moved on, and that was the purest form of forgiveness. But the pain, that she would have to bear alone. Because when true love is destroyed, the punishment doesn't come from the other, it comes from the echo of one's own choices. And in that moment, she felt the weight of what she had lost not as a memory, but as a sentence. Daniel's love now belonged to another story. And she, for the first time, accepted that her ending had already been written long ago, on the night she traded the certainty of sincere love for the illusion of being desired. As the wind blew stronger, she closed her eyes and let the cold wash over her. There was nothing left to do. The love that had sustained her was now just a memory, and regret her only companion. Time would pass, and perhaps she would smile again, but never in the same way. Because some pains don't heal, they only teach. And there, alone before the water that washed away the last letter, Emily finally understood that losing a true love is losing a piece of yourself that never returns. The months that followed were marked by a disconcerting calm. There were no more messages, connections, or attempts at reconciliation. Everything that had once been vivid, intense, and shared between two passionate bodies now resided in the realm of silence, of private memories, of irreversible absence. Daniel woke early, prepared his coffee with almost ritualistic precision, and navigated his days with the tranquility of someone who had experienced the hell of disappointment and managed to come back whole. He was in no rush, no longer chasing answers, no longer seeking to understand where everything went wrong. Because, deep down, he understood that love doesn't disappear suddenly, it leaves traces, signs, small flaws that we insist on ignoring until it's too late. And over time, he stopped trying to understand and simply accepted. Accepted that sometimes love isn't enough. That loving isn't enough when the other chooses to hurt. The new woman by his side was discreet, simple in her words, and generous in her presence. She didn't compete with the ghosts, simply walked beside him in silence, patiently embracing old pain and offering a fresh start without demands. She didn't ask about the past, but listened when he felt the need to talk. And Daniel, who once thought he would never trust again, realized that loyalty doesn't need to be shouted, it's proven in the details, in actions, in daily care. This new love lacked the explosiveness of before, but carried a depth that soothed. It was the kind of relationship built with time and truth. A relationship where both were whole, not trying to patch up broken pieces. Meanwhile, Emily continued facing the mirror. The days passed with the same weight she knew so well, the weight of someone carrying wrong choices and knowing there's no going back. Not that she didn't try to move on. She met other faces, shared coffee with other voices, tried to smile at other hugs. But no hug was the same, no conversation made her forget Daniel's silence. Because, deep down, she knew she'd lost something you can't find twice. He'd lost the trust of someone he loved with everything he had. And that, she discovered the hard way, can't be regained with flowers, messages, or promises. She'd lost the home they'd built together, lost the Sundays, the calm glances, the tranquility of sleeping next to someone who chose her every day, even on the days she couldn't choose herself. One afternoon, sitting alone on a park bench, she saw a father playing with a small child. He laughed, chased the boy, deliberately falling over just to get a laugh. The boy climbed onto his father's back, and the woman watching from afar smiled with a mixture of affection and pride. Emily knew what she was seeing. She knew what it meant. She knew what she had lost. Because, yes, she and Daniel had once dreamed of children. They had dreamed of afternoons like these. And there, seeing that man balancing between the child's laughter and small tumbles, she recognized the look. It was him. It was Daniel. Beside him, the woman who now occupied the place that had once been hers. And in that woman's lap, the son who would never exist between them. Emily stood there, motionless, her hands clasped tightly on her knee, her heart pounding in her chest. For a few seconds, everything stopped. She didn't get up, didn't hide, didn't try to attract attention. She simply watched. And understanding that moment was like diving into an icy sea. Life had moved on. It hadn't waited for her. It hadn't forgiven her as she imagined. Life had simply rebuilt everything she had destroyed. Only with other people. In other hands. In other hearts. That night, returning home, she opened the box where she kept Daniel's old letters. They were all still there. Yellowed, some with dried drops of tears I didn't even remember crying. She read them one by one, as if each word were a blow. And the pain wasn't in what was said, but in what she ignored while there was still time. Each letter was a silent plea for her to look at him. To see him before it was too late. But she chose not to see. Chose not to hear. And now, each word was a cruel reminder of what she had taken for granted. Years passed. And life became what it always becomes when we don't take care of what we love, a repetition of days that led nowhere. Emily dedicated herself to work, avoiding meetings, parties, and places where she might bump into someone she knew. Not because she felt ashamed of others, but because she didn't want to face her own conscience. Friends drifted away, invitations stopped coming. And even surrounded by professional achievements, she felt empty. She had succeeded in so many areas, but failed in the most important, loving someone without hurting them. Daniel, however, even with all the scars, managed to find beauty again. He didn't forget what he'd experienced, but he learned to give the past its rightful place. He would sometimes visit his old apartment, now rented by another family, and smile when he saw the different curtains, the new plants, the changed paintings. It was as if life was saying, "It's over." And he accepted it. He continued teaching, writing in old notebooks, and now he had a new story to tell. A story of new beginnings, but also of loss. Because, even happy as he was, he knew that parts of us remain trapped in certain pages that can never be written again. The last time he saw Emily was by chance. She was walking past a cafe as he walked out with his son in his arms. They glanced at each other for a brief moment. She smiled kindly, he merely nodded. There was no resentment. But there was also no longing. Only respect for everything that had been and would never be again. She understood in that instant that there was no longer room for her in his life. And he continued walking, without looking back. Because some chapters shouldn't be reread. And, as painful as it may seem, the only way to honor a story is to let it rest in the past. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment below with your opinion. I want to know how this plot touched you. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel, because here you'll hear stories that don't just entertain, they teach, warn, and make you reflect deeply on the choices we make. Betrayal, even though it sometimes seems like a response to monotony or a momentary impulse, always takes its toll. It destroys homes, extinguishes dreams, and in many cases, forever changes the course of life for people who only wanted to be truly loved. When someone chooses to cheat, they don't just betray the other person, they betray the history they've built, the moments they've shared, and most importantly, they betray themselves. This channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. All the stories here are fictional, but the pain they carry is very real. They reflect what can happen when we fail to value those by our side. Until the next story. And may you always choose to love with respect, with presence, and with truth.